When Tom Hardy's mansion was sold, the buyers couldn't see what they found in the basement, because that secret room held evidence of the decision that destroyed his career. What the buyers discovered in that hidden basement would shock the entertainment industry and reveal the truth about how one of Hollywood's most successful actors lost everything in just 18 months. This isn't just a story about money. It's about obsession, betrayal, and a decision so catastrophic it destroyed a £120 million fortune overnight. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn about Tom Hardy's financial collapse will change everything you thought you knew about wealth, fame, and the dangerous game of high-stakes investing. The date was March 15, 2023. Tom Hardy stood in the marble foyer of his Hampstead mansion, the same house that had been featured in Architectural Digest, the same house where he'd hosted charity galas and industry parties. But today, it was empty. The auction house had already removed the furniture, the art collection, even the custom-built wine cellar that had cost him £2 million alone. His accountant, David Mitchell, stood beside him holding a briefcase full of documents that told the story of the most spectacular financial collapse in Hollywood history. "Tom," he said quietly, "we need to go through these one more time before the bankruptcy hearing." But Hardy wasn't listening. He was staring at a small crack in the marble floor, a crack that led to something no one else knew about, something that would explain how a man who had earned over £150 million in his career could lose it all so completely. The media had been speculating for months about Hardy's sudden financial troubles. Tabloids reported everything from gambling debts to secret divorces, but none of them came close to the truth, because the truth was hidden 20 feet below where they were standing, in a room that Hardy had spent £5 million creating and another £50 million filling. "Mr. Hardy," his lawyer's voice cut through his thoughts, "the buyers will be here in an hour for the final walkthrough. Is there anything else we need to remove?" Hardy's hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept the only key to the basement room. Inside that room were computers, documents, and evidence of investments that had seemed brilliant 18 months ago, but now looked like the work of a madman. It had all started with a phone call, a single conversation that would lead to the most expensive mistake in entertainment history. The man on the other end of the line had promised Hardy something every actor dreams of: true creative control, unlimited budgets, and the chance to build a movie empire that would rival any studio in Hollywood. What he hadn't mentioned was the price. And by the time Hardy realized what he'd signed up for, it was already too late. The house sale would finalize in 3 hours. The basement would be sealed forever, and the secret of how Tom Hardy lost everything would be buried with it, unless someone was brave enough to tell the truth. The story begins in September 2021, when Tom Hardy was at the absolute peak of his career. Venom, Let There Be, Carnage had just broken box office records. His production company, Hardy Son and Baker, was developing multiple projects, and his personal net worth had reached an estimated £120 million. By any measure, he was one of the most successful actors of his generation. But success, as Hardy would learn, can be its own trap. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Hardy was at home reviewing scripts. The caller introduced himself as Marcus Blackwood, representing something called the Meridian Entertainment Group, a name Hardy had never heard before, but which would soon consume his life. "Mr. Hardy," Blackwood's smooth voice carried an unusual urgency, "I'm calling because we have a proposition that could change everything for you. Not just another film deal. We're talking about ownership, control, legacy." Hardy had heard similar pitches before. Every actor at his level received offers from production companies, investment groups, and entrepreneurs looking to capitalize on celebrity status. But something about Blackwood's approach was different. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering something much more seductive: power. "What exactly are you proposing?" Hardy asked, setting down the script he'd been reading. "Complete creative autonomy," Blackwood replied. "Your own studio, your own distribution network, unlimited budgets for any project you want to develop. And the best part? You'd own 60% of everything we build together." The proposal was intoxicating. Hardy had spent his entire career working within the studio system, subject to executives' whims and shareholders' demands. The idea of creating something entirely his own, of having the kind of control that only a handful of people in Hollywood possessed, was irresistible. But there was a catch. There always is. The initial investment required would be substantial. Blackwood continued. "We're looking at approximately £80 million to secure the necessary infrastructure, talent, and distribution rights. But based on our projections, you'd recoup that investment within the first year. £80 million. It was more money than most people could comprehend. But for someone worth £120 million, it seemed manageable, especially with the promise of returns that would dwarf his initial investment. What Hardy didn't know was that Marcus Blackwood didn't exist. At least, not in the way he presented himself. The Meridian Entertainment Group was real, but it was a front for something much more sinister. A sophisticated financial scam that had already claimed victims across multiple industries. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and increasingly complex financial arrangements. Hardy flew to New York, Los Angeles, and London, meeting with people who claimed to be investors, distributors, and industry executives. Everything seemed legitimate. The offices were real, the business plans were detailed, and the people involved had impressive credentials. But it was all an elaborate illusion. The first red flag should have been the secrecy. Blackwood insisted that all meetings be conducted under strict non-disclosure agreements. The investment structure was so complex that even Hardy's financial advisors had trouble understanding it. And most concerning of all, the money was always flowing in one direction, out of Hardy's accounts. "Tom, I'm getting uncomfortable with this," his longtime financial manager, Sarah Collins, warned during a meeting in early 2022. "These contracts are unusual, and the fact that we haven't seen any returns yet is concerning." But Hardy was too deep to turn back. He'd already invested £60 million, and Blackwood assured him that the delays were temporary, just regulatory hurdles that would be resolved soon. In fact, Blackwood suggested this might be the perfect time to increase the investment. The studio they were building was about to launch its first major project, and additional funding would accelerate the timeline significantly. Against all advice from his team, Hardy liquidated more assets. His Malibu beach house sold for £15 million. His collection of vintage motorcycles brought in another £3 million. His investment portfolio, carefully built over 2 decades, was systematically dismantled to feed what he believed was the opportunity of a lifetime. The meetings became more frequent and more elaborate. Blackwood introduced Hardy to other supposed investors: a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, a media mogul from Germany, a financier from Hong Kong. Each had their own impressive credentials and their own reasons for believing in the Meridian project. Hardy found himself in boardrooms with some of the most successful people he'd ever met, all apparently convinced that this venture would revolutionize the entertainment industry. What Hardy didn't realize was that these other investors were also victims of the same scheme. Each believed they were part of an exclusive group building, something revolutionary. Each had been carefully selected and psychologically profiled to ensure they would be susceptible to Blackwood's manipulation. The psychological warfare was subtle but devastating. Blackwood employed every technique in the manipulator's playbook. He created artificial scarcity by suggesting that other major studios were trying to buy into the project. He exploited Hardy's fear of missing out by regularly mentioning opportunities that were time-sensitive. Most importantly, he fed Hardy's ego by positioning him not just as an investor, but as the visionary leader of a new entertainment paradigm. "Tom, this isn't just about money," Blackwood would say during their regular video calls. "This is about legacy. Your name will be associated with the biggest disruption in Hollywood since the studio system was created. You're not just investing in a company, you're investing in changing the world." By summer 2022, Hardy had invested over £100 million in the Meridian Entertainment Group. His liquid assets were nearly depleted, but he was assured that production would begin any day. The first film in their slate, a big-budget action thriller that Hardy would star in and produce, was supposedly in pre-production. The final push came in August 2022. Blackwood called with urgent news. A competing studio had made an offer to buy out Meridian for £2 billion. It was an opportunity to cash out immediately with massive returns, but there was a catch. The buyer wanted to see evidence of Hardy's full commitment to the project. They needed him to invest an additional £20 million to demonstrate his belief in the venture's future. It was the classic sunk cost fallacy in action. Hardy had already invested so much that the thought of walking away and losing everything was unbearable. Against the desperate pleas of his financial team, he mortgaged his mansion and liquidated his children's education funds to raise the additional money. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Sarah Collins, and her voice was shaking. "Tom, you need to get to my office immediately. We've discovered something about Meridian Entertainment Group." The truth was devastating. Meridian wasn't building a studio, they were running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. The offices Hardy had visited were rented by the day. The executives he'd met were paid actors. The business plans and financial projections were complete fabrications. And Marcus Blackwood? He was actually Martin Kowalski, a convicted fraudster who'd served time for securities fraud in the 1990s. But the worst part was still to come. While Hardy was learning about the scope of the fraud, FBI agents were raiding Meridian's offices in 3 cities. They seized computers, documents, and financial records that would eventually reveal the scheme had defrauded investors of over £500 million. Hardy wasn't the only victim, but he was by far the largest. The investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of the operation. Kowalski had assembled a team of 47 people across multiple countries, each playing a specific role in the deception. There were fake investors, fake industry executives, fake lawyers, and even fake journalists who had written planted articles about Meridian's supposed successes. The psychological manipulation had been extraordinarily sophisticated. The team had studied Hardy for months before making initial contact, analyzing his interviews, his career decisions, even his social media activity to understand his motivations and vulnerabilities. They knew about his difficult relationships with studio executives, his desire for creative control, and his competitive nature. Every aspect of their approach had been tailored to exploit these specific traits. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychologist who analyzed the case for the prosecution, would later testify about the sophisticated nature of the manipulation. What we see here is a textbook example of affinity fraud combined with authority bias and sunk cost fallacy, she explained in the court documents. The perpetrators studied Mr. Hardy's psychology extensively and tailored their approach to exploit his specific vulnerabilities. The legal implications were staggering. While Hardy hadn't committed any crimes, his association with the scheme meant his finances would be under federal scrutiny for years. Every transaction, every investment, every business deal would be examined and potentially frozen while investigators tried to trace the money. Within weeks, Hardy's remaining assets were tied up in litigation. His production company couldn't access its funds. His agents couldn't negotiate new deals because his ability to fulfill contracts was questionable. And most damaging of all, news of his involvement with the scheme began to leak to the media. The headlines were brutal. Tom Hardy loses fortune in fraud scheme. Venom star's £100 million mistake. How Hollywood's toughest guy lost everything. But the public humiliation was nothing compared to the private devastation. Hardy had always been intensely private about his finances, and now every detail of his wealth and spending was being dissected in bankruptcy court. The mansion in Hampstead was mortgaged to the hilt. His cars were leased, not owned. His children's education funds had been liquidated to cover mounting legal expenses. The basement room in his mansion became his refuge during those dark months. He'd installed it years earlier as a private office, but now it served as a command center for what felt like a war against financial ruin. The walls were covered with charts, documents, and timelines as Hardy tried to understand how he'd been so thoroughly deceived. His wife, Charlotte Riley, found him there most nights, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, trying to find a way out of the financial maze that was consuming their lives. "We'll get through this," she would tell him. But they both knew their old life was over. The wealth, the security, the freedom that money provided, all of it was gone. Hidden behind a false panel in the basement room were documents that revealed Hardy had suspected something was wrong months before the scheme collapsed. Email exchanges showed his growing unease, but Blackwood's responses were masterful manipulations that exploited Hardy's commitment to seeing projects through. In one email dated April 15, 2022, Hardy wrote, "Marcus, I need transparency on when production begins. My advisors are asking questions I can't answer, and frankly, so am I." Blackwood's response was a masterclass in manipulation. "Tom, I understand your concerns and they're completely natural. What you're experiencing is what every visionary faces when they're building something revolutionary. Disney faced similar doubts when he was building his empire. The difference between success and failure is often just persistence through these uncertain moments." By the end of 2022, Hardy's net worth had dropped from £120 million to negative £15 million. He owed money to lawyers, accountants, and creditors. His home was in foreclosure, and his future earning potential was severely compromised by the ongoing legal proceedings. Conclusion: 500 words. The final blow came in January 2023, when Hardy learned that recovery of his lost funds was virtually impossible. Kowalski and his associates had moved the money through a complex network of offshore accounts and shell companies, making it nearly untraceable. The 100 million pounds Hardy had invested had simply vanished into the digital ether of international banking. Standing in his empty mansion for the last time, Hardy reflected on the brutal irony of his situation. He'd spent his career playing characters who survived impossible odds, who fought back against overwhelming forces. But real life, he'd discovered, didn't offer the same heroic narratives. The bankruptcy hearing was scheduled for the following week. Hardy would have to surrender his remaining assets, including personal items that held sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. The watch his father had given him when he got his first major role, the motorcycle he'd ridden in his breakthrough film, wedding gifts that represented happier times when financial security seemed permanent. But perhaps the most painful loss was intangible. His reputation for being careful, intelligent, and business savvy. Industry insiders who'd once sought his advice on investments and business deals now whispered about his massive mistake and questioned his judgment. Scripts that would have been offered to him automatically now went to other actors. His agent reported that studios were hesitant to insure him for major productions, fearing that his financial distress might affect his performance or availability. His children would grow up knowing their father had once been incredibly wealthy and had lost it all. His wife, who'd married him when he was an established star, now faced the prospect of rebuilding their lives from nothing. The stability and security that money provided, private schools, healthcare, homes, all of it was gone. The basement room was finally sealed 3 days later when the new owners took possession. Inside, still hidden behind a false wall, were the documents that chronicled Hardy's desperate final months, loan applications that were denied, investment opportunities that might have saved him, and increasingly frantic communications with lawyers and financial advisors. But also hidden in that room was something else. Evidence that Hardy had been working on a comeback plan, scripts he'd been writing during his darkest hours, business proposals for smaller, independent projects that required minimal upfront investment, plans for a gradual return to the industry that had enriched and then ruined him. One document, handwritten on letterhead from his former production company, outlined a 5-year plan for financial recovery. It included taking any available acting work, no matter how small, selling his story rights to help other potential victims, and most ambitiously developing a one-man stage show about his experience, turning his greatest failure into his path back to solvency. Today, Tom Hardy is slowly rebuilding his career. He's taken smaller roles, accepted lower salaries, and approached every opportunity with the caution of someone who's learned the difference between calculated risks and reckless gambles. The man who once commanded £10 million per film now works for scale, grateful for any chance to practice his craft. The fortune is gone forever. The mansion belongs to someone else. The lifestyle of unlimited possibility has been replaced by careful budgeting and modest expectations. But Tom Hardy is still acting, and perhaps that's the only wealth that ever really mattered. If this story shocked you about how quickly wealth can disappear, subscribe for more incredible celebrity financial disasters.